So I've been posting up some historical Chain of Command World War II podcasts, vlogs, posts over on my blog. The link to my blog is underneath this video. We've been looking at Battletech. We've been looking at 40K, some Tyranid stuff. And this has generated some interesting feedback, not only on the videos, but exploring wargaming, exploring this interesting concept of recreating a narrative with miniatures and terrain and rolling dice and missions and rules. The primary difference between historical wargaming and sci-fi wargaming. And it took me a while, certainly in all the years I've been playing wargaming, most of my front-loaded early experience was sci-fi stuff. It's only in the past 5 years or so that I've been really getting into heavily into historical wargaming. And those first couple of historical wargames were huge. Just the shift in thinking and how they operate, it was really, really potent. I mean, there's always a learning curve, but there was like a learning curve on the learning curve. So I wanted to kind of push out there, in my opinion, and I'd love to hear your feedback because it's great. I love playing games. I love collecting and painting, but I love networking. I love stepping out of my local meta of gaming and tapping into you guys on YouTube and your channels and your blogs and kind of your miniatures and models and on Twitter and getting those other ideas. So I would like to get your opinion too in the comments, either here on my YouTube channel or over on my blog, the main difference between historical versus fantasy. Now, certainly units, if we're looking at Chain of Command, World War II, we don't have any psychers from Warhammer 40,000. We don't have any monstrous creatures or space bugs. While we have bolt weapons in Warhammer 40,000, we also have las weapons and plasma weapons. We don't have that tech. We got tanks in both and support vehicles and artillery in both systems, but they're radically different. If we look at something like Battletech, we don't have 100-ton walking tanks and mechs and all this type of crazy stuff. So certainly the units are different, but they can't be compared because it's completely different settings. They operate on dice. Okay, they have dice. They have different missions, but those missions do have some similarities. You know, breakout missions, recon missions, engage missions, just go head to head, blow each other up for a number of turns. So there's similarities there. Certainly there's skirmishers and outflanking and fast-moving units and all this type of stuff. The biggest change for me was realizing that historical wargaming, that word, historical, I thought it meant, a setting, and certainly it does, but history is not fair. No one goes to warfare if things are equal. You go either out of desperation or if you believe you have an advantage, more so if you have an advantage. So the first couple of times you start playing Chain of Command or historicals, you realize the missions are not fair. Things are not in balance. You might be at a tremendous advantage or disadvantage. We're getting ready to play the invasion, D-Day. We're getting ready to play. I'm playing my late war Germans. I've got some interesting tanks and tech in there. But at this point in the war, the German numbers have been depleted tremendously. America's coming in on an invasion fresh, and I've got to basically defend Fortress Europe against the invaders on here. Looking at that, the Americans and the British, depending on what's going on there, they have tremendous advantage of numbers, of material, of tactics. So you look at some of the missions for late war, support points, the Germans don't have as much. What they do have is in extreme limited quantities. So yeah, I've got some pretty heavy Tiger tanks, but I've got one. In terms of the size of the engagement, I have access to one, maybe two. But the Americans are throwing down multiple Shermans. They have other light support vehicles on there. A lot of stuff. History looks in that moment. When I was playing my Romans, historical Romans, in certain engagements, when we were trying to expand the empire out, going up against the Gauls and in Germania and stuff, the Romans I had less numbers. I mean, my friend's lining up his stuff, and it's like Legion. You're like, wait, I thought I was the Imperial Legions, and I'm outnumbering you. I was tremendously outnumbered. But the discipline and the tactics and some of the war machines that I had access to really made a massive difference. So you start playing historical war games, and you realize it's not fair. Can your ego get past that? Now, compare that with BattleTech. Compare that with Warhammer 40,000. Compare that with modern social war games. X-Wing miniatures. You and I have, insert, battle value, point level, power level. Something where it's equal, a pool of resources, of points that we can spend, and we make decisions on what we want to spend. Do you want an elite army? Do you want a horde army? Do you want Death Star units? Do you want a mix of everything? Do you want to specialize in the assault? You want heavy mechs, light mechs, everything all across there. Now, certainly list building and rules and synergy, all important tactics, but in theory, based on a point buy-in value, you and I should be about on equal terms. If we were playing a game that had point values, a modern war game, and we said, look, okay, you have 2,000 points to build your army, and I have 5,000 points. You'd be like, what? You're a cheater. No way. It's not going to happen. That was the biggest adjustment for me, looking at historical games. You're trying to recreate historical battles. Now, we played a lot of what-if battles, where you look and say, well, what if this was successful? Or, what if this general decided to actually do this? Or what if this part of the war, you can get into sci-fi fiction historicals. But even in that, if you're really looking, there's going to be a difference in tech. There's going to be a difference in what can be fielded. As a historical wargamer, can you accept that? Can you understand that? Can you play through that? And even knowing as the enemy's approaching and they're outnumbering you 10-1 and they have better equipment, that doesn't matter. This is historical wargaming. You've been issued your orders. You have the men and vehicles under your command, and you need to achieve victory. It's a very different gaming experience. It has a different meat. It has a different bite to it. And for me, historical wargaming, that was the biggest switch. Not only understanding that, but also in the tension, good tension that it creates. I play some of these scenarios. I play some of these games, and it's not that I'm not having a good time, but it's a very serious tone. It's a fun, serious tone, but it's a different type of pressure you're under, where you realize like you're not only dealing with tactics and all these other things, but you're dealing with, based on the mission, what you have to achieve. Not before the game, okay, we're going to play 2,000 points tomorrow. Let me look through all my models and let me select what I'm going to select. And, I feel like playing all tanks this time, so I'll play all tanks. Or I feel like playing a mix this time. It's like, no, what was the historical period? This is where you were. In my mind, that's the biggest difference, and that's the biggest jump if you're going from kind of super sci-fi fantasy to historicals. And I do know one or two players that did the opposite. Friends of mine that were hardcore historicals that made the jump into 40K, and it just drives them nuts where, all the things they can take, or they're like, certain armies would never be fielded this way. It like makes no sense, or tanks are supposed to be rare, and I can field like 15 tanks? Where are we getting these resources? Or wait, so in the narrative, there's an entire chapter has 100 suits. My other friend was like, wait, my chapter has 100 suits of Terminator armor. Across the entire Imperium of Man, this chapter has 100 suits of Terminator armor. I'm throwing down 30 of those suits in this game. If I lose them, how does the chapter even survive on that? From their mind, it's sci-fi, but they're thinking historical. They're thinking like, shouldn't there be like maybe on an entire planet-wide engagement, one Terminator suit, and that's by like the chapter master on there? So interesting ways, different ways of seeing it, of experiencing this awesome hobby of historical or sci-fi wargaming.